So with me to discuss how a myriad of players across critical sectors are sort of sharing information back and forth, I have Robert Mayer. Robert, are you here? Please be here. Come on up, please. He's a vice president of industry and state affairs with the United States Telecom Association. Scott Aaronson, a managing director for cyber and infrastructure security at the Edison Electric Institute. Really appreciate you. You look great up there. And Amit Khosla, a business information security officer at U.S. Bank. So, gentlemen, just as a starting question, you guys all represent different sectors of critical infrastructure. I'm curious how your definition of threat intelligence has kind of changed over time now that that intelligence is sort of being shared. Robert, would you like to start?
Sure. I think fundamentally it actually hasn't changed that much if you get past the jargon in cybersecurity. I was looking at a definition that Gartner had written about threat intelligence, and it was like, a paragraph long of every conceivable component of threat intelligence. But when you get down to it, basically what you're talking about is, who's attacking, how are they doing it, what are they after, and what has been the impact on your assets. So you're basically looking for context and information that can be actionable and in a very quick way. And I think those fundamental aspects have been consistent for a long time. I think what's happened now is that there is an increasing recognition that to be effective in this environment, you really need good threat intelligence. And there is a lot of activity at the government and in industry and across sector activities to try to improve that process.
Amit, obviously, you guys have an internal threat intelligence group, right? I mean, how do you think about sharing that? And how is that? Sharing that information, and has that kind of changed over time?
I think so. I think that as cybersecurity threats have grown, the comfort level around sharing threat indicators and information has also grown. Strong leadership that understands the nature of what is being shared and pushing their teams to do so, enable the team to share useful information in a timely manner. The old analogy that, if you help protect the neighborhood, it keeps your assets safe as well as those of your competitors and suppliers, and that's something that we see more and more of. Over time, we're also seeing a lot more automation coming into play. How do you characterize information so that it can be shared and then rapidly consumed or reviewed by your partners that you're sharing it with? What we've seen is a switch from the PDF sharing or just sharing a blank indicator that has no context to a bit richer data so people have an understanding of what this means and how they can use it in their infrastructure.
I mean, Scott, how does this information kind of come across, right? I mean, this has always been, like, is it just like secret back rooms, like secret back rooms inside conferences?
So there's certainly, there's the classified component of it, and then there's also going to be the more open source that's also, I want to say yes and to everything that my co-panelists just said.
I feel like they said it all.
They did, and the only thing I'll add to it is when we think of threat intelligence, there was a period where it was the technical people in back rooms either getting classified briefings or getting what was known as, and still is, actionable intelligence. Well, actionable intelligence can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. The way we talk about it in the electric sector is making sure the right people are getting the right information at the right time. The right people, in some cases, can be senior executives who aren't going to be operators. They are not button pushers. They have nothing to do with the actual mitigation of said threat. But if the senior executives aren't aware of the threat, they can't provide the resources or the direction or set the priorities for the button pushers who are going to do something else. So right people, senior executives, operators, and then also something we're seeing more and more of, automated threat intelligence and getting some of the humans out of the equation entirely, doing machine-to-machine information sharing.
So when I'm thinking about information sharing environments, I can think about something as simple as a meeting, right? Or I can think about like a listserv. I think that's how a lot of threat intelligence gets shared back and forth just through regular email. I mean, now, moving on to a really specific group, right? I mean, the groups that you referenced, Scott, are relatively small, right? I mean, FS-ISAC, I mean, these are small, kind of really secretive groups. I don't know if that's popular to say. I mean, are they effective
Well, okay, so let me clarify that. So the ISAC has grown tremendously over the number of years, which is good, getting a lot of the institutions involved. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the institutions are consuming or producing data to the general distribution lists, or that the data is tremendously useful in all cases. There are a number of smaller, targeted working groups within the ISAC, where specific things are focused on. And then you have a lot of very active players, and they're sending out a lot of information and helping teach the other folks, hey, I care about this because it means something significant to me in my institution. So it's large in numbers. The number of active participants is significantly smaller than the overall. But again, it's more than just ISACs. It's trusted groups within the industry, cross-sector trusted groups, other ISALs that the government's kind of pushing to stand up.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of data out there. The key thing is get as much of it as you can that's useful and that's consumable.
Scott, you look like you want to say something.
Sure. I mean, I'll piggyback on some of the things Amit was saying with respect to ISACs. They serve an incredibly important purpose that is specific to their specific sector. And if you think of the forums for threat information, it's not just the government. It's not just some subset of the industry. It's actually, I call it a mesh network. There's a universe of information out there, and what ISACs can do is make it relevant to their specific sector and then feed it back out to a broader subsection of that sector, or taking information from the subsector and bringing it back out up to be useful to some of the other critical infrastructure sectors.
Sure, but I mean the number of active participants are really small, right? Go ahead, Robert. I don't mean to interrupt.
No. I think it's important what you're raising, but I wouldn't necessarily associate with the size with effectiveness.
Okay.
All right. So it depends on what you're looking at and when you're looking at it. So, for example, in our sector, the things that are going to be of most concern to us is the availability of the networks. These are global, regional, national networks. When there are things that we observe through our network flows, and they're substantial, you have what's called trusted pools. We don't call them secretive, but they're trusted pools. And these are really the technical people who are making the initial observation, thinking that this is something that is probably being seen elsewhere on the networks. So there'll be relationships that have developed over time. Calls made, are you seeing this? Yes, we're seeing that. Do you know where this is emanating from? Yes, how are they using an exploit, whatever, is it a DDoS? So those types of events are purposely not necessarily brought to a large group because your first inclination is to limit the damage and remediate the problem. And often this occurs within the industry realm. So we're doing some work now at the FCC through the CISRIC process, which is a carved out voluntary effort that looks at best practices, and we're looking at information sharing. And we've identified, formal environments, informal environments, structured information sharing, unstructured information sharing, and you can imagine all the permutations and all the different parties that are involved. But it's a very sophisticated process, and it hasn't just been invented. I mean, this has been working for decades and evolving, and has its history in the physical domain and is now brought into the cyber domain.
I think you touched on something really important, that the reason for these information sharing groups is to create relationships. Like, from my purview, most of the information that I hear happens between individual operators without necessarily even like high level executives knowing that it's happening, right? Like, I know something's going on, I tell my buddy looks like a genius all of a sudden because he knows about a threat that's happening at a different institution. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the bro network is alive and strong.
Let us not call it the bro network.
And it's not just bros anymore, that's for sure.
Yes, it is. We have moved past the bros.
The sisterhood, that's right.
Yes, all of the things.
But those trust communities that exist and sort of form organically, sometimes they are cross-sector and regional. Sometimes they are people who used to work together and now they're all over the world. Sometimes they are formed for specific purposes and then disband after that specific purpose goes away. Response to a denial of service attack, for example. So all of these relationships grow up, and what we want to do is incentivize those. You don't want to stand in the way and have this, as Robert's alluding to, this sort of dogmatic, sort of top-down, draconian process. No. Let all of those, again, mesh networks do what they do, and then find ways to make sure that the right people are getting the right information at the right time by socializing more broadly the information that's being generated amongst these trust communities.
One thing I'd also like to add is the emergence of the vendor partners that we all have here. So there's been a tremendous, growth in that area. They provide great data for us to start looking at, and I want to call it data because their intelligence feeds aren't always actionable or relevant to their consumers. So sometimes they just say, listen, we're doing a lot of research, we see vulnerabilities, we see threat actors, this may or may not be of interest. To the Intel team, you have to take that, see if it's applicable to your line of business, your executives, whatever, store it, use it as you can, and move forward. But we see a lot of great data coming out of our partners.
Just as an aside, and so I'm horribly interested, maybe no one else is, but is that data becoming more contextual? Or like that individual threat intelligence, is that becoming more contextual? And are those contextual pieces getting shared?
I would say so.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I answered my own question. It's great. We're talking about the effectiveness of the ISACs. I mean, is there any kind of sanitized examples that any of you gentlemen could provide me that kind of say, this is where this really worked? If it was not for this informal information sharing environments or this formal structure, right, we wouldn't have been able to combat a very specific threat. You can sanitize that example as much as you want. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I can give you a current example. So on Friday, most folks here are aware that there was a major attack on a DNS provider.
The Mirai malware.
The Mirai attack, yeah. Started, I think, at 9:30 in the morning. Through the efforts of the Comms ISAC, which for us is a very long-standing ISAC that we have in partnership with the DHS National Coordinating Center, we convened an industry call with DHS at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the intention of, one, trying to understand what was happening and what was the best information at that time, because people were obviously in a intelligence gathering mode. But more importantly, as a sector, to say, look, we're ready. We want to, if there's a role for us, we're prepared to help. I don't think, in the absence of having that structure, we could have convened such a large group of network service providers on such short notice. So these structures, and now you will probably talk about the ISAOs, are forming. They're evolving. They're tailored to circumstances based on lessons learned. And some of it is very successful, and there are areas where there needs to be improvement. And one of the areas I think that needs improvement is the cross-sector coordination, and Scott can talk about some of the things that we're doing, in fact, these three sectors, to facilitate some of that.
So I'm happy to talk cross-sector, but first, just to sort of answer directly yours, and because it came up as part of Rolf's presentation, is what happened during Ukraine. Our ISAC, the Electricity Information Sharing Analysis Center, did a phenomenal job of taking information that was external to the United States, but obviously had impact and implications, whether it was political or technical, here domestically, and in a very short period of time got a little bit of information out to a very broad community, and then in a little more time, as the fog of war lifted and what we understood what was actually happening in Ukraine, we were able to take very specific information about that incident and generate specific mitigation activities that could happen here. To the point that you made early on in the conversation about the size of ISACs, so the electric sector is one big machine, thousands of owners and operators, 55,000 substations. It is North American, so Canadian, United States, a little bit of interconnection with Mexico. There are really big companies, most of the ones that you've heard of that serve large metropolitan areas. There are smaller, cooperatively owned, municipally owned systems. How do you take a municipal or a cooperative system that does not have the sophistication and size and resources of a really large company that is dedicating resources to this security, but ensure that this one big machine that we all have ownership of can remain secure? There is this culture of mutual assistance in the electric sector where the big folks and the more sophisticated folks understand that they can be the rising tide that lifts the boats and help to get that information socialized more broadly across the sector. So there is a great example of trust communities at a high level leveraging the infrastructure of the ISAC to be able to get very specific mitigation information down into the people who can do something about it.
I like how you talk about socializing information, making it normative, right, to share things back and forth. Robert, I just want to go back before we talk about how everyone is happy and everyone holds hands, which is wonderful. I'm very excited. You mentioned last week the Department of Homeland Security very quickly got on a phone call with your folks. I mean, there's a lot of industry talk that government isn't necessarily, they want access to everything, but they're not necessarily the best at sharing. And when they do share, they don't necessarily share enough and in a timely manner. I mean, is that kind of industry perception? I mean, is that in any way true, or?
Well, I think you have to parse that in many ways, and I think from our sector's perspective, given the long-standing history that we have in terms of working in our ISAC with the National Coordinating Center, the dialogue is substantial and it's quick, and it's if there isn't value add in a moment of crisis, people know that very quickly, and they will not spend time engaging the partner in a conversation. Generally speaking, when we're in a crisis situation, in an incident, it's important to have a dialogue with the government and share information, because if you look at recent big events, Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the flooding, those kind of, government brings resources that the private sector cannot bring to the table, and brings a level of coordination through different agencies, maybe FEMA, maybe DHS, could be different agencies within a state. I think when you combine those resources with the industry resources and a common interest in resolving a problem well, it generally is a smooth and efficient and valuable process. That's not to say there aren't areas and incidents where we see a lot of inefficiency, and when we see it, we call it out. We don't do it publicly. We have a conversation with people and say, that really didn't work. And we've had instances like that. And here's why it didn't work, and please fix it, because if you don't fix it, it's going to be a problem going forward. But that's not something that is generally in the public domain, because that's really not the best way to work through those things.
Amit, I saw you shaking your head. I know that for folks internal to a company, you have to have certain classification, like government classification, to get a hold of certain information. I mean, is that limiting in any way in terms of what's shared and the timeliness of it?
It is.
How it's shared?
The idea about classified information, sometimes it's great classified information, and if enough individuals at the company don't have the requisite classification, it can't be shared. Yeah. So, the button pusher can't tell the CISO, what he needs to be changed to, get away from the threat. So aside from the classified information sharing piece, the Department of the Treasury, which is our sector agency, is very supportive of the sector. They provide a lot of resources, a lot of engagement on how do we build a more resilient and operationally secure sector. The FBI and Secret Service will, assist as much as they can, dealing with the law enforcement investigations that they're uncovering, and then DHS as well. So when it comes to sharing that threat information, the classification is helpful. Industry, I think across the industries, we prefer it. Just declassify as much as you can, get it out in a very useful manner. For the stuff that can't be declassified, sure, bring us in, provide the clearances, and make it an easy process.
So Scott, is that what you would say to government partners? It's important to declassify things as quickly as possible to get the information out?
It's sort of a two-way street. We're never going to create enough clearances for the sectors to be able to get all the information into the hands of the button pushers and people that can do something about it. So the only solution, yes, classified information is important, and we want to have that, and we want to have access to that. But the only way we're going to actually mitigate an issue is by creating the tear lines that get below the classified information and get that out into the hands of people who can do something about it.
And Scott, coming back to you again, Robert posed point that now across industry sectors, folks are sharing with one another. I mean, up until now, it's been very siloed. Financial services industry, so financial services, electric.
Right.
Farmers share with farmers.
There's a farmers only joke.
Yes, I know. I didn't think I was funny either. It's okay.
We can laugh. That's good.
That's good. I'm glad.
So this has grown up organically also over time, and there's a lot of reasons why. First of all, I think everybody recognizes there are threats to critical infrastructure. We, the electric sector, have been unfortunate enough to be the tip of the sword. We are a convenient rhetorical device. an attack on critical infrastructure is going to black out the East Coast for 18 months. It's a great headline. There's movie scripts written about it, and this is what we have to respond to. What I don't think people recognize are the interdependencies across the sectors. If we don't have telecommunications, we can't operate. If we don't have financial services, we don't have access to capital markets, we can't trade our product. We don't have transportation and pipelines, we can't move our fuel. We don't have water, we can't generate steam and cool our systems. There are profound interdependencies where an attack on any of those sectors I just mentioned could actually impact the delivery of electricity. Yeah. So given that reality, we have recognized we have all of the incentive in the world to continue to do the things that are important to the electric sector vertically, but also to work cross-sector with those that we have those interdependencies.
I would think that it would start with the people who own the wires, right?
Not necessarily.
Not as well. I mean, if you're handling all the network traffic, like you can block all the things, right?
Well, hold on. There are a couple of issues.
I know. I apologize.
I know you said okay. So first of all, the dependencies are equal. All right. So when we have power outages, we have battery supplies and we have generators, and they can last for 24, 48 hours. In the home, they can last for 8 or 12 hours. And after that, if there's no electricity, you're basically down.
Yes.
Okay. Having the financial and commerce operating is very important in terms of the supply chain. So I think there's an equal dependency across the board. The issue about the role of having the wires it tends to sometimes get a little bit touchy because the impression somehow that because we create that connectivity, we have some unique obligation, or more importantly, some unique capability. If you look at recent attacks and you look at Mirai, for example, and what happened on Friday, it's very clear. And the things with the Internet of Things issues, that it's an ecosystem that is interconnected, and just trying to say that one part of that ecosystem can provide the security and the reliability that everybody wants is just not the case in cybersecurity. So that's why these conversations across the sectors are so important, and that's why you see, for example, NTIA under the Commerce Department doing these multi-stakeholder initiatives now around vulnerability disclosures, around the Internet of Things, because there's a recognition that unless we bring the ecosystem into the discussion, we're not going to optimize the outcome, and I think that is very unique in some respects to the cybersecurity and how we deal with those threats.
So there, like when we talk about security, there is no competitive advantage when we deal with threat information.
Well, unless you're selling it,
which a lot of people are, and not very well.
Well, but there's a role for that. I mean, there are organizations that sell that intelligence, and the more they can have a revenue source to fund really good intelligence gathering, that benefits my members. So I know that for my members, it's not unusual for them to have a half a dozen or a dozen feeds real time from companies that have a business model that depends on that. So you don't want to eliminate that, and there's great risk if you take that equation out of the current ecosystem that it'll disrupt it in negative ways.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go on to folks in the audience. I'm getting a nod from my colleague off stage. He's very eagerly holding a microphone. But I mean, that's interesting, right? Because I know a lot of banks look at their threat intelligence operations inside of their corporations as competitive advantages, right? I mean, does that ever materialize in terms of what's shared?
The business side may look at it that way, but on the operational and threat intelligence side, if there's something significant, it gets shared out to trusted partners, because again, talking about the resiliency of the ecosystem, if one bank or one entity goes down, it hurts everybody.
Because of shared not just shared customers, but shared wires, shared grid.
Yeah, we're networked industries, and so we have. Look, I'll give the patriotic answer, which is we're critical infrastructure, and we understand our obligation to the life, health, and safety of Americans. I'll give the business a more cynical answer. If our stuff isn't working, we're not making money. There's reputational risk. There's operational risk. We have every incentive to work together to address that.
Well, a great answer to leave off right in the eve of an election. So, are there any questions? Please, this gentleman over here.
I just wanted to put a footnote on something Scott pointed out about the sharing information after the Ukraine incident. I would just, as a recently retired from Department of Energy, stress the point that the richness of the data that we gathered from that and put out resulted from Department of Energy ensuring that the right people were on the team that went over to assist the Ukrainians. We fought to get private sector subject matter experts that would be internationally recognized as authoritative, including a senior representative from the ISAC itself. If we hadn't put those people on the team, as good as the other interagency people were, the value of the information would not be nearly as well received by the sector if we hadn't done that.
That's a hugely important point, and I didn't plant Mike there, but I know him very well and like him. And he and I work together, government and industry. What he just said is sort of profoundly important about government doesn't have a monopoly on good information. Industry doesn't have a monopoly on good information. It really is the merging of the two that becomes relevant to the sector and that ultimately leverages some of the capabilities that our government partners have. So we don't have, well, we have some intelligence gathering capability, but it's certainly not as robust as the three-letter agencies that you all know. We don't have a law enforcement mandate. We don't have a national security mandate. But by the same token, the government isn't necessarily good at operating our systems. Bringing the two of those things together creates a more rich tapestry of information that can be leveraged by the sector.
Any other questions? Anyone want to make me feel good? Just ask something. Paul, of course.
Excellent panel. Thank you very much. One of the problems I think that comes up in the U.S. is that there is, and I guess maybe in some ways this panel reflects that, is that there is a very sector-by-sector approach to some of these issues when, in reality, if you kind of step back, many of these problems are not sector-specific, right? And you can look at denial of service attacks or ransomware or any of the bad stuff that's happening, and it's not limited to one sector. How is it necessary for us to break out a little bit from that sector-specific mode? And I might ask you also, if we look to across the ocean to EU and some of the initiatives that are happening in the EU, any lessons to be learned there for the U.S. in terms of things to do, things not to do, in terms of coordinating cybersecurity across the economy?
You want to talk about the SIC?
Sure. I'll start. I don't want to monopolize this. Actually, Amit and I were talking a little bit before. This notion of north-south, sort of government to industry, industry to government, specific sectors, has been the way that we've been organized, I think, for the better part of the last couple decades. There's an east-west component across the sectors that's really important. A good analogy is the NCIC. So the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center, for those of you who don't speak alphabet soup, you've got the NCIC, and it brings together all of the various units of government, in some cases the sector-specific agencies of some of the critical sectors. An analog to that doesn't necessarily exist on the private sector side. So one of the things that, in fact, with these two sectors we've been working on is the development of a strategic infrastructure coordinating group. And much as we have individual sector coordinating councils, bringing together some of the most strategically significant ones, those that provide communications and finance with electricity, with a goal to bringing in others that provide sort of the foundation of society. I would argue some of the transportation modes and water fit into that as well. This comes from a recommendation from the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, which said, we're starting to organize across the sector-specific agencies to be more efficient in working across the government. We need to have that same level of partnership to make more efficient our threat information sharing, our ability to respond and recover, the deployment of tools and technology, and just the general awareness that allows for better security, better defense, better response and recovery if we are not exchanging business cards during the incident, but have developed these relationships ahead of time. And so this formation, which is in its nascent stages of a strategic infrastructure coordinating group, is something we're very proud of.
And so,
Does it have a name?
Yes, it does.
You can
SICK.
plug the name. Go ahead, plug the name.
Go for it.
Go for it, Robert. I know you're proud of this.
Well,
It's a terrible. It's a terrible.
No, it's a
acronym.
great.
It's
No, say it.
Strategic Infrastructure Coordinating Council.
That's it.
Physics.
SICK.
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 It's sick. Okay, it's great.
Just sick.
Super sick.
I just want to get to the second part of the question for a
Yes,
moment.
please. I just wanted you to plug that.
So I think probably, Scott, you'd agree. I mean, our sector has a significant global component, especially when you're talking about tier one ISPs, carriers that have global backbone networks. So what happens, in Europe and what happens in Asia and other countries has a significant impact on our business and our customers. I think in the United States we've made incredible headway from a policy perspective after Executive Order 13636 came out, which was improving cybersecurity critical infrastructure. That resulted in the National Institute of Standards and Technology under Commerce to lead an effort to develop a cybersecurity framework, which was designed to be flexible and prioritized and cost-effective and voluntary. And because of the way it was designed and frankly the way it was facilitated by NIST, it was an incredibly successful effort. And I think that from our sector's perspective, and I think many sectors, we see the NIST framework as a foundational cornerstone for a taxonomy around cybersecurity, but also a way to engage not only large companies, but mid-sized and small-sized companies in improving cybersecurity. Where we would get concerned, and we've seen some indications in Europe through their directive, is when you start moving down a path where it becomes overly prescriptive, number one, and number two, and just as problematic, when it becomes balkanized, so that you have issues with cross-border data flows and how data in transit and data in storage is required to be protected. And when you have all those different schemes, having a frictionless global system of communications becomes more complicated. So I think, sometimes I think the United States has a reputation for trying to impose a regime on other countries. In this case, I think we have a very thoughtful approach. And I wouldn't try to describe it as imposing, but we're hoping that we can show that through our success, it should be transported and adopted, even if it's not word for word and the framework per se, but the notion of risk management as a construct, as opposed to overly prescriptive mandates, which just don't work in cybersecurity. Regulation cannot keep up with the pace of activities in cyber.
Did anyone else have a question? I know we don't have much time left. Just going back to something, I mean, are there issues with sharing information internationally? Like, is that really the sticking point here, right? Because it seems like, at least at home, like we do a fairly good job at trying to be thoughtful and creating a framework where everyone can share. But we talk about the ecosystem. The ecosystem is international as well.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Please, go ahead.
So, one of the big challenges that a lot of folks are aware of are privacy laws dealing with, what constitutes customer data, privacy data, things of that nature. So, trying to understand, pardon me, from a broad base, what can be effectively shared without, breaking rules, breaking laws is always an ongoing challenge. And for something that's voluntary, which cyber threat information sharing is, nobody wants to share it and then get a hand smack or a regulatory fine for breaking the law.
That's a big deal. And there are also, internationally, there are deeply embedded cultural barriers to sharing information. So in some cultures, anything that looks like you're sharing a vulnerability, is a shameful kind of activity. So those kind of things affect information sharing.
Tom?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I really want to add something to this specific topic, which is that...
It's Tom Cross from Drawbridge Networks, an incredibly handsome man.
Absolutely. So,
point the camera that way. Feel the whole glow.
So the WASNR rules for the sharing of intrusion software also come into play with respect to international information sharing, and I wanted to make that point. I think the British government indicated, or their export control authority indicated, that they thought that whenever malware samples were being shared internationally by organizations within the UK, that export licenses were being applied for every single time, which is completely ridiculous. Yeah. And so there's a serious disconnect there between the people who do export regulation and the actual reality of international information sharing. And if the export control folks have their way, that they could significantly slow down or impede international information sharing with respect to security incidents. So thanks for letting me add that.
Important point.
Well, it's an incredibly important point.
I'll just add, these two sectors are far more international than we are. We are international and that we are North American. But what we have found is a number of other countries that I will just allow to remain unnamed have been really interested in the way the United States has organized itself to deal with critical infrastructure, information sharing, and security. So in addition to the threat information sharing, I think there's a great value to developing relationships, not just across sectors, but across borders, which are going to ultimately help all of the United States and all of our allies be much more prepared.
Great.
Scott, thank you. Hey, guys, thank you guys so much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. So